Really good to be here. And I'd like to just thank Christos and Susie yet again for inviting me to participate in this conference. And initially, I couldn't find a direction that would bring together my current research interests under the topic phenomenology and mindfulness. But as is usually the case, if you sit with a conundrum long enough, something begins to emerge. And I had already begun research papers on the role of attention in aesthetics and also attention at the intersection of care ethics and phenomenology. And so now in this paper, I'm bringing this work in attention into another domain, phenomenological psychiatry and the treatment modality of mindfulness. So here is the abstract that I gave for this particular paper. So phenomenology has proven immensely valuable in the psychiatric context to better understand anomalous experience and psychopathology since the time of Jaspers in the early 20th century. Now mindfulness is being promoted as one of the key treatment methods to establish more balance in the life of individuals challenged with mental health issues. Phenomenology and mindfulness come together in the foregrounding of sensation, bodily awareness, and fine-tuned attention to experience. So this paper examines how the quality of attentive presence the psychiatrist or therapist brings to the encounter with the individual experiencing mental health challenges as crucial to both understanding and healing. How is attentive presence achieved and sustained in this encounter? Okay, as Clive also mentioned in the preceding day that Christos had given the green light to present works in progress. And so this paper is one of these. I've had a really crazy 6 months getting established in a new job, and this last week has been especially crazy. So I will be hoping that you people will be able to give me some really useful criticism and some suggestions at the end. So I'll be aiming to join the dots, so to speak, of a few key threads that I think can usefully illuminate the relevance of the notion of attentive presence beyond the religious applications and meditational practices towards situations requiring understanding and empathy, such as in the therapeutic context. My line of approach is going to be like this. First dealing with the commonalities between meditational practice and phenomenology, then looking at Merleau-Ponty's notion of hyper-reflection. It's an underdeveloped idea within his philosophy, but I think it's sort of pointing to something quite interesting. Then I'll look at presence and attentive perception, and then the psychiatric context with anomalous experience and the notions that Jaspers promoted of verstehen, understanding, and presence. He had two concepts, verstehen and eklärung, which is understanding and explanation, but we're going to look at verstehen and presence. So the psychiatric context also sort of requires transformation. So I'm going to look at this through the lens of this idea of presence. So to begin, commonalities between meditational practice and phenomenology. As you would probably know, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Schiller, Heidegger, and Merleau-Ponty all had some familiarity with some of the Asian traditions. And I've just learned today Jaspers did as well. So, you know, there's quite a solid grounding here for a useful comparison to be made. A number of presenters have already indicated that there are points of commonality and the meditational practice of mindfulness, but there are also points of difference. So the most obvious being that phenomenology belongs in the sphere of Buddhism, whereas mindfulness originates in the religious tradition of Buddhism and has clear soteriological aims. Enlightenment, no less. So nonetheless, phenomenology has been found to be very adaptable to theological projects, and there is a distinct and renowned theological turn within phenomenology, which, its merits notwithstanding, remains contentious to today. So, for example, we have philosophers like Emmanuel Levinas, Paul Ricoeur, Jean-Luc Marion, Jean-Louis Chrétien, Michel Henry, and more recently, Emmanuel de Saint-Norbert, who have developed phenomenology in distinctively theological directions. And then on the other side, we've got Dominique Janicot, who has advanced critiques of both Heidegger and this theological turn within phenomenology. So it's still a live issue. So phenomenology and spiritual traditions are thus not necessarily antithetical. There is also the recent scholarship that is revealing many previously unacknowledged or hidden threads of influence from Asian thought into phenomenology, and arguably in the other direction, with the philosophers I've already mentioned. So many of the speakers in this conference have drawn on Heidegger in particular and his notion of Gelassenheit, which translated in various ways, but notably calmness, serenity, letting be, as reflecting closely the aims of mindfulness practice. We now know that there's been a lot of borrowing of ideas from Asian thought within Heidegger's writings, and some of this is acknowledged and some not. I remember always first when I read Heidegger many years ago, and I thought, gosh, this, sounds like Taoism or Zen Buddhism, which I was already familiar with. And in recent years, these hidden sources in Heidegger's philosophical vision have been revealed. So I've put that there for you in case you're not already aware of that, the work of Reinhard May. And sometimes he's outrageously borrowed, word for word, without acknowledgement, as he sometimes did with Husserl as well. Anyway, despite these scholarly failings, Heidegger is without question one of the key thinkers of 20th century philosophy, who was able to synthesize the various threads of influence into a provocative philosophical vision. So I'm not being dismissive of Heidegger at all. I'm just pointing out that, he had his flaws. Anyway, so with all of that as our background, we can see that there is clearly a legitimate basis for investigations into the commonalities and recognitions of similarities. So in my view, there are a number of significant intersections. Firstly, both the philosophical tradition of phenomenology and the Buddhist contemplative tradition begin with lived experience. Secondly, they both seek to reveal and transform experience. And thirdly, they are both interrogating the exact same world, and discovery is fundamentally defined, and they discover what is fundamentally defined by interdependence and radical contingency. So these are the bases of this same world that they're interrogating. So I think that's really interesting. That's a really strong basis for saying, yes, okay, let's check further into the commonalities. So having established some context to the paper, I would like now to present some of the alignments between the practice of mindfulness and Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology. It is important to note that the term mindfulness sits within a broader practice known as shamatha, and this is more holistic and reconnects mindfulness practice with its metaphysical and ethical foundations. As mentioned yesterday, both mindfulness and phenomenology have been co-opted for purposes beyond their own aims, sometimes leading to reductionism and distortion, and even to destructive purposes. And so you will also be aware there's been pushback to reclaim the fundamental epistemological and ethical purposes of both methodologies. Okay, I have included here a painting by Cézanne, whose artistic virtuosity demonstrated for Merleau-Ponty the same methods and understandings of phenomenological interrogation. So this is Mount Sainte-Victoire in Provence, which he painted numerous times. And I think it sort of demonstrates also this sort of notion of hyperreflection. So although hyperreflection is not discussed extensively in Merleau-Ponty's writings, it evidently became increasingly important for the completion of his overall philosophical vision. The key references he does make to hyperreflection, however, give us a sense of what he thought this notion could achieve. Importantly, he understands hyperreflection as not just an idea, but it is also a practice. It is something a philosopher does. So Merleau-Ponty proposed this capacity for hyperreflection would enable us to move beyond reflective tendencies to reveal the otherwise obscured brute reality underlying everyday reality. So in the preface to the Phenomenology of Perception, Merleau-Ponty already anticipates this task, which this concept practice of hyperreflection is set to address in the later writings. So he writes, but phenomenology is also a philosophy for which the world is always already there before reflection begins, as an inalienable presence, and all its efforts are concentrated on re-achieving a direct and primitive contact with the world and endowing that contact with a philosophical status. So in seeking to interrogate this capacity, Merleau-Ponty sees himself as completing something that was actually underdeveloped in Husserl's philosophy. Though I'm very happy to be corrected if I'm wrong about that by Husserl scholars. And he proposes that hyperreflection goes beyond Husserl's eidetic reduction. Because, as Merleau-Ponty writes, every reflection is eidetic, it still leaves, quote, untouched the problem of our unreflected, irrefléchi being and that of the world, unquote. That's from The Visible and the Invisible. So Merleau-Ponty's hyperreflection seeks to achieve that which was elusive for Husserl. So here we have an early articulation of this idea. What is needed is, quote, a radical reflection that recognizes its own contingency and dependence on the pre-reflective givenness of the world, unquote. So hyperreflection discovers the double genesis of the existent world, quote, what is thought, quote, unquote, and the genesis of reflection, what thinks, being and thought, objectivity and subjectivity. And we must be clear, this is not a rejection of reflection, but rather hyperreflection exposes the blind spot of reflection. It is reflection mindful of its situated character, of its fundamental impermanence and contingency. It brings the mind back to the present, to the brute perception, or to the emotions stripped of the story. So that's, we can sort of recognize that there's some really strong commonalities here with mindfulness practice. So the fields of phenomenal and intersubjective awareness that hyperreflection exposes are marked by contingency and interdependence. And co-relatively, as situated beings without a God's eye view, we are defined by contingency, by our interdependent relations with others and our shared world. And I think it was Francesca in her paper who highlighted the shift away from a dominating agenda that is really crucial to this kind of approach. Not trying to impose, our agendas on others. So we could say that hyperreflection acts as a corrective to reflection, to being always caught up in thought and stories, and returns us to the brute primordial experience, its spontaneity, its dynamism, its freedom, so that once again the world appears as strange and paradoxical. In this way, hyperreflection dissolves the totalizing and reductive tendencies of reflection, not just in the epistemic domain, but also in regard to our relations with others. It resists those tendencies to objectify others, to reduce them to our preconceptions and our agendas. So, and herein lies its potential for not only transformative and therapeutic purposes, but also for the ethical dimension as well. So Taoism, and here we've got an image of Lao Tzu, not sure how to pronounce it, the Tao Te Ching. Taoism and Buddhism have for many centuries told the story of a primordial contact with the world, unmediated and uncontaminated by reflection, a contact waiting to be discovered, which is potentially available to all. And they've expressed this as, quote, bare attention, ordinary mind, mindfulness, shamatha, and vipassana. So this primitive contact is possible because, as Merleau-Ponty notes, the world is already there. And the style of thinking, phenomenology, quote, existed as a movement before arriving at complete awareness of itself as a philosophy, unquote. And here's another quote that I think is really evocative of what he's trying to accomplish here. So we shall find in ourselves and nowhere else the unity and true meaning of phenomenology. It is less a question of counting up quotations than of determining and expressing in concrete form the phenomenology for ourselves, which has given a number of present-day readers the impression on reading Husserl or Heidegger, not so much of encountering a new philosophy as of recognizing what they have been waiting for. Okay, so I've put that there. I've put in italics in concrete form that the phenomenology for ourselves. So that's, I think that's really key. And also that idea of, you know, we've been anticipating this for a while. It's been there for us to discover. And so whether it's Buddhism or phenomenology, it doesn't really matter. The world is already there. And so this is a task for every person, and it must be expressed in concrete form for ourselves. It is a manner or style of thinking understood through its living practice. The point is for it not just to remain at the level of reflection, another device in the intellectual repertoire. And while in the Asian traditions, this method is more programmatic than in phenomenology, nonetheless, we get a sense that of this in practice in the evocative writings of both Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger. It then seems no accident that Merleau-Ponty, as the philosopher of the perceiving body, recognizes the potential in the practice of hyperreflection, of attentive percipience. And this brings us back to that first level of awareness and mindfulness, the body and or the breath, that which sustains the body, and of which Harvey spoke of so insightfully in her paper. Okay, so now let's move on to the next piece of the puzzle, presence and the role of attentive perception in establishing this presence. Yeah, I like to mention this kind of a fun interview I saw with Bill Murray not that long ago. I think it's on YouTube. Bill Murray of Ghostbusters and Lost in Translation, who is a Buddhist. And he was asked by the interviewer, what are your ambitions for the coming years? What do you still hope to achieve in life? And his response was, after thinking, he said, I'd just like to be more present. Okay, so I think that's really telling. Okay, so perception inherently depends on the body and vice versa. And percipient bodies are situated in the phenomenal realm as well as the intersubjective realm. Merleau-Ponty emphasized there are no isolated sense data. These are not only unfindable in experience, they are inconceivable. Objects necessarily exist within a field, whether visual, auditory, tactile, etc. So too, disembodied, solitary, worldless subjects are unfindable and inconceivable. Subjects exist within both the phenomenal field and the intersubjective field, including the shared world in virtue of embodiments and percipience. So the role of attention and perception warrants closer attention. Merleau-Ponty begins firstly with critical analyses of the two predominant accounts of attention in the history of philosophy, empiricism and rationalism. He exposes the limitations of these attention as searchlight accounts before setting out his own. So the initial aims of Merleau-Ponty's analyses of attention are thus directed at refuting empiricism and intellectualism / rationalism, which support their accounts of objectivity. So Merleau-Ponty writes, quote, empiricism deduces the concept of attention from the constancy hypotheses, that is the priority of the objective world, and proposes that attention is a spotlight illuminating pre-existing objects hidden in the shadows. So what we can understand from this account of attention, it is disinterested and neutral to its objects. And so we might ask, where does consciousness actually come into this account? And further, how can a consciousness come to know such an object? What is it that chooses the object of attention? Because there are multitudinous objects on offer, which one are you going to choose? It would, as Merleau-Ponty describes, be necessary to show the power of perception to awaken attention, and then how attention develops and enriches this attention. So on his account, empiricism thus has no resources to tackle these issues because it relies solely on external connections. Merleau-Ponty then begins his consideration of the opposing account of intellectualism/rationalism, drawing on Descartes' example of the piece of wax, which reveals that consciousness either grasps its object with clarity or with degrees of confusion. The form, for example, of either the candle shape of the wax or perhaps of a geometric circle of a plate exist only because consciousness already put them there. So he sums up his rejection of both accounts thus. What was lacking for empiricism was an internal connection between the object and the active triggers. What intellectualism lacks is the contingencies of the opportunities for thought. Consciousness is too poor in the first case and too rich in the second for any phenomenon to be able to solicit it. So empiricism does not see that we need to know what we are looking for, otherwise we would not go looking for it. And intellectualism does not see that we need to be ignorant of what we are looking for, or again, we would not go looking for it. So the upshot is that both empiricism and rationalism presuppose a pre-existing objective world for which attention provides neutral access, either directly through sensations or indirectly through representations. However, Merleau-Ponty proposes that attention transforms the experience and is, quote, a new way for consciousness to be present toward its object. And it does this by creating a perceptual field according to the specificities of the exploratory perceptual organs, unquote. If the object includes features such as color, light, and form, then the field created depends on visual exploration. If it includes features of sound, tone, rhythm, then the field created depends on auditory exploration. Until attention is directed toward the object within a sensory or thematic field, both the object and the field remain indeterminate. The subject is unable to identify, to understand, to make sense of the perceived object until attention is solicited. And the field, even if not the focus of attention, is still an active presence within the perceptual encounter. So we can say the perceptual syntax includes attention, which brings the constellation of givens together, gives them sense, and moreover, guarantees that they can actually have a sense. So attention is thus neither neutral nor indifferent to its objects. Attention transforms the experience of the object. Okay. So attention for Merleau-Ponty is clearly transformative in that it gives a subject a new way of being present to objects. However, in the intersubjective domain, I am proposing that attentive presence is triply transformative, giving simultaneously a new way to be present to the subject's sense of self and the sense of the other subjects and the sense of self of that other subject. So there are three things going on here. So perceptual attentiveness therefore transforms the experience of the one perceiving attentively and the experience of the recipient of the attention simultaneously. So presence is not the outcome of attention, nor attention the outcome of presence. They are co-arising, and attentive presence is transformative. More broadly, we can say that intersubjective attentive presence is a reversible relation, and this is why it serves both to underwrite and illuminate the authenticity of the therapeutic encounter. The difference between being present to objects and being present to other subjects is also supported by recent studies in the psychology of perception. So Sean Gallagher, in his chapter, Inside the Gaze, draws out some interesting philosophical insights in considering the case of a young man whose perceptions were affected due to pressure impacts of deep sea diving, followed by a long flight. In brief, in his perception of objects, he enacted a two-step process. Firstly, the visual identification of the object, and then secondly, he needed to become aware that it was in fact he who was visually identifying the object. The sense of self-ownership of the experience was not automatic. However, this young man on psychometric testing was entirely normal, and so too his social interactions and recognition of others were not impacted at all. So Gallagher, while acknowledging further empirical research is needed, suggests that whereas the perceiving subject seems to have an inalienable sense of mindness in the experience of another perceiving subject, with objects this may dissolve. So while objects are capable of defining a different vantage, it is only with other perceiving subjects gazing back that a subject has the irrefutable sense of me, that I am present, that I exist, that this experience is mine. And Merleau-Ponty remarkably anticipated the significance of these recent scientific findings through his philosophical analyses. So where are we? Here we go. So he writes, just as perception of a thing opens me up to being by realizing the paradoxical synthesis of an infinity of perceptual aspects, in the same way, the perception of the other founds morality by realizing the paradox of an alter ego, of a common situation, by placing my perspectives and my incommunicable solitude in the visual field of another and all the others. So, and it is this reversibility within attentive presence with another subject that facilitates a transformative and therapeutic outcome. That, for example, with a person suffering anomalous experience, the attentive presence of the psychiatrist or therapist offers the possibility of transformation in the sense of self. A door is opened to a new way of being, and whether the individual steps through the door is another question. Okay. So there's a wonderful French saying, which I really liked, appreciate when I was living there, quote, being comfortable in one's own skin. And we can also say being comfortable in one's own world. And this is exactly what is at issue with the individual suffering anomalous experience. They are not comfortable in their own skins, sometimes not even in their own skin. They have been hijacked by delusions, obsessions, fears, and anxieties. And so being present in their own skin is a fraught endeavor. And very likely many of us have had this experience to varying extents. And so to have someone else hold the situation with an attentive, caring presence opens up the space of possibilities again. And one is no longer overwhelmingly hostage to the fears, the self-recriminations, and the obsessions, etc. One is able to move towards self-presence, which had previously been too confusing and too painful. And on the everyday level, one is able to drop the bundle of anxieties and gloom and just be. There's a very lovely story that was told by someone who was one of these monks that walking through the forest with the Thai Buddhist master Ajahn Chah. He was the monk in the previous image too, the meditating monk. And, you know, it's sort of, he makes fun of them, their naivety. So he points towards the giant boulder and asks, is that boulder heavy? And when all the monks replied, yes, yes, very heavy, very, very heavy, he responded, it isn't heavy if you don't try to pick it up. And so this presence, we can say, is a way of dropping all the heavy boulders we may have picked up over the years. Of course, some of the boulders may be heavier and more difficult to drop than others. So There are now numerous empirical studies demonstrating the sometimes powerful transformative effects that mindfulness and other contemplative practices can have for those suffering from mental health issues. And we can say that the techniques as such have been in use already for some time, either as just a simple reminder to the person suffering to bring their attention to their breath, perhaps agitated breathing, shallow breathing, or breath holding, etc. You know, what is happening for you at this moment? What does this mean for you? So too, the capacity for presence has also been in evidence without it being called such. If we go to some of the instructions given by Carl Jaspers in his seminal General Psychopathology, such as the task of the psychiatrist is not to learn psychopathology, but to learn to observe, to ask questions, analyze, and think in psychopathological terms. And this is in the preface to the General Psychopathology. So it is testament to his insights in this domain that it is still a key text in the training of new psychiatrists. And further, that his general approach to psychopathology is useful as a framework for understanding the new treatments, such as mindfulness. So Jaspers identified two methods for approaching psychopathology: eklärung, explanation, and verstehen, understanding. Explanation is based on the scientific investigations of causation. So understanding was to be achieved through close observation, empathy, and a careful, sympathetic reading of the patient's self-reports, or listening of the patient's self-reports. And it was Jaspers proposed that it was through these the psychiatrist will be able to transpose himself or herself into the patient's own experience, to immerse himself, herself into the experience of the patient, to make present the experience of the patient. Of course, here we know from the work of Edith Stein that empathy is not an entirely reliable means of understanding others, that our own grasp of another's situation can be influenced by our own agendas and personal history. Jaspers was, of course, aware of the potential pitfalls and recognized the need for constant self-examination on the part of the psychiatrist to avoid imposing and dominating the narrative of the patient. Jaspers also used the term Dasein, but for different ends to Heidegger. For Jaspers, Dasein was living in the world, and living in the world comes under scrutiny, particularly when there is breakdown, or what he referred to as a limit situation, when life becomes unbearable. And with this limit situation, depending on insight and resilience, the individual may plunge into mental disorder with symptoms manifesting, or transcend the situation and grow psychologically. So the psychiatrist would be aiming to sort of pull them back, you know, through the symptoms to be able to grow psychologically through their suffering. And so the training of a psychiatrist is as much about learning the canon and the methodologies as the development of their own character, their personal resilience, authenticity, emotional intelligence, and their capacities to attend to the patient, to hold the space in the psychiatric encounter without judgment and without leaping hastily to diagnosis and a treatment pathway. So the aim is to allow the patient to be as they reveal themselves with a mindful co-presence, so that the case history grows into a biography which dignifies the multifaceted roots of the psychological disorder. So Jaspers describes the relationship as one of freedom to freedom, from patient to psychiatrist and back again. And in this way, the relationship can become one of mutual enlightenment. So here we can see a similar strategy to that of mindfulness meditation, that both are aiming for a non-domineering, authentic presence, a presence within themselves, which naturally flows onto attentive presence with others. Okay, so this is where I end, and I realize there's a lot more work to do, but and I really appreciate criticisms and suggestions. You can shoot them through to me in an email if you wish. Yeah, but very appropriately, thank you for your attentive presence.